Okay, I'm going to start, I guess. If people join late, that's okay. So we are on session 4 of Everything You Always Wanted to Know. And I wanted to ask you a favor for next week before we start. My nephew is speaking to the annual meeting of the Madison Jewish Federation at 7:30 next week. I wonder if I'd like to see it. I wonder if we could do our class from 6:30 to 7:30 next week. Is
Sure.
that okay with folks?
Fine with me.
Fine with me.
Fine
Works
with
for
me.
Okay, anyone got a problem with it at all?
Oh,
Mm-mm.
No problem. Which nephew?
Dan, the judge from Israel.
Oh,
He's
that's, I didn't know if you had other nephews.
I do have other nephews, but
Okay.
he grew up in Madison and made Aliyah, if you can believe this, 30 years ago.
Wow.
Wow.
And
Dina, is he the one we met in Israel?
yeah, the one who was
Okay.
at the time he was working at the Supreme Court, but now he's a judge.
Wow. That's
And
pretty cool.
so anyway, yeah, so I would like to hear him talk.
Oh, sure.
So if that's good, we'll do that next week. And if you talk to other people, let them know. I'll also put it in the e-news. So our topic tonight is sorting out Jewish texts. And, we hear these terms that we'll be talking about tonight all the time, and we see quotes from different sources all the time. But it's confusing. What are all these texts and why are they important? Or are there some that are more important than others and so on? So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And I'm going to start with the first term we're going to learn is Tanakh. I don't know how many of you know this term Tanakh. It's the Hebrew word for the Hebrew Bible. And it actually is an acronym. So it's not a real word. So the T in Tanakh, as you see below in the green, is for Torah. And the N in Tanakh is for Nevi'im, or the prophets section of the Bible. And the K, or KH, at the end of a word would be Ch, but the word is Ketuvim, are the writings. And you put them all together and you get the whole Bible, and that's why we call it in Hebrew Tanakh. And I'm going to click on this link now to, I hope Safaria will come up. Is there a new page up there now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, there is.
So as it says here, Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, is Judaism's foundational text. The word Tanakh is an acronym of its 3 parts that I just mentioned. Torah, which I think most of us know are the 5 books of Moses. Nevi'im, the prophets, and we're going to see what all books are in there. And Ketuvim, the writings. And so Torah, as I think probably a lot of you know, is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and that's what's on the scroll in the synagogue. Prophets is a much bigger section, and it includes books that aren't necessarily the writings of prophets or even about prophets, but are really more historical books. So narrative books. So good examples of those are Joshua and Judges, which are is the story of the entering and conquest and settlement in the land of Israel after leaving the wilderness. And then the books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, which has to do with the start of the kingship in Israel. And then 1st and 2nd Kings, which are the stories of Elijah. It's also Solomon's reign, King Solomon's reign, and then the stories of the Elijah the prophet and his disciple Elisha, and the division of the country of Israel into northern and southern kingdom and how they sort of fall apart. And then there's the words of prophets. So Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, these are all names of prophets whose writings we have, or at least they dictated their writings to someone who wrote them down. Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Those are all of the books of the prophets that are contained, or the historical books that are contained in the section known as the prophets or the Nevi'im. And finally, writings or Ketuvim. So that includes the Psalms and Proverbs, the Book of Job, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. These last five, are called the Megillot, the 5 Megillot, or the 5 scrolls, the most famous of which, of course, is Esther, because it's featured on Purim. And also in the writings are the Book of Daniel and Ezra and Nehemiah and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which really are very repetitious of the books of about the kings, the earlier books about the kings. So let's see. Try to get out of this and back to my slides and see if that can happen. So that is all of what is contained in Tanakh. Are you seeing my slides again now?
Yep.
Yes, very nice. And of course, for us, if you've spent time in the synagogue, you know that. Let me go to this first. Oh, people keep popping on. Okay. In the synagogue, you can read along, right, with whatever the reading in Torah is for that week, or the prophetic reading for that week, which I'll explain in a moment. But we do not have in the pews a whole Hebrew, English, or even just English Tanakh. And that's because a lot of those books that you just heard the names of, we don't use in the synagogue at all. So if you want to have on hand at home the whole Tanakh, I assume you would want to get Hebrew English or just English. The ones that I highly recommend are the Jewish Publication Society, or JPS Tanakh, or the Koren Jerusalem Bible. Both of them are excellent Hebrew English translations, and this is the one that we give to our confirmation students when they are confirmed. So they all, after 16, they all should have one in their home and hopefully take it with them. They get a student-bound edition, which is a little less expensive, but these are nice leather-bound copies that you can get. There are probably some other good ones as well, but these are the ones that I recommend if you want to have a whole Bible in your possession at home. So Torah, as we just mentioned, are the books Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And this book, of course, is this section of the Tanakh is highlighted above the others because of the way we keep the Torah on scrolls, as we have done ever since ancient times, in a very special niche in the sanctuary, the Ark, or the Aron HaKodesh, the way we take it out with pomp and circumstance and walk around with it and sing while it's out, and we unroll it and chant from it in the Hebrew, and a blessing is said before and after. So and every year, we read the entire Torah. I mean, theoretically, or symbolically, we read the entire Torah in Reform Judaism. We read an excerpt from each Torah portion every week. In traditional congregations, they read the entire Torah portion, which is anywhere between 3 to 5, maybe even in some cases 6 chapters of Torah. And if you go to a more traditional congregation, it takes a long time to read all that, and it makes their services much longer. So in Reform Judaism, we read an excerpt. We teach about that Torah portion during the week that's coming up. So these books, all of them really from Tanakh, are what we call our sacred scripture. That would be what Jews consider sacred scripture. and are the most important because they form the basis of our synagogue use and holiday reading cycle and teaching on a week-to-week basis. Doesn't mean that the other books that I'm going to talk about later aren't very important and significant, but they're not considered sacred scripture like the books of the Tanakh are, and among those, especially Torah. You may be wondering, well, then what is the Haftarah, which is actually a completely different Hebrew word. It has nothing to do with Torah. It just sounds like there's a Torah and then a Haftarah, but they have nothing to do with each other. It means a concluding or additional reading. What I mean is semantically, the words have nothing to do with each other. So a Haftarah is a concluding or additional reading, and on Shabbat and the holidays only is another passage read from the Tanakh. Not if you're reading Torah on a weekday morning, which does happen on Mondays and Thursdays in congregations that have a weekday minyan, Monday and Thursday mornings. You do not read a Haftarah, though, only on Shabbat or on festivals. And these are excerpts from the Nevi'im, or prophets section of the Tanakh that I showed you, that long list that included actual prophets whose words we have, or narrative sections of the prophets. And they were chosen back in the rabbinic period to fit thematically either with the season or with the theme of the Torah portion. Sometimes I find it a bit of a stretch how they were connected to each other, but I think the rabbis, the sages, wanted to represent more of the Tanakh literature in what most Jews, the only thing they experience when they hear these texts is when they're at tefillot or services. There are Jews, of course, who go to weekly study or daily study, but the rank and file members of the community, probably the most times they're going to be exposed to their sacred texts are in synagogue services, and so excerpts were chosen to be highlighted during services. And then some of the other books from the writings, they're not really Haftarot, even though they are additional readings, but they're usually not called that, are come up on holidays. So we already mentioned Esther gets read on Purim. Each of the festivals has one of the Megillot. So on Passover we read Song of Songs, and on Shavuot we read Ruth, and on Sukkot we read Ecclesiastes, and on Tisha B'Av, that summer mourning holiday for the loss of the temple, we read the Book of Lamentations. And of course, I think you recognize that lots of times in services we're reading Psalms as part of the service. So some of those writing section books do get read in the sanctuary and part of synagogue use, but not all of them. So you may be wondering, well, why do we have another book in the sanctuary and not the Tanakh? Because the answer is because these books that you are seeing in front of you, except the green one, what I'll talk about in a minute, they include the weekly Torah portion in the order that we read them in the synagogue on Shabbat annually, from Genesis, Reshit at the very beginning, and then to Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that we finish on Simchat Torah and then start all over again. They include that cycle of reading, and they include all of the Haftarot, the Hertz, the two on the left, the Eitz Chaim, the red one, and the Pentateuch and Haftarah book is the J.H. Hertz Torah commentary. We have those in our pews. We don't have the cover. This is a paper cover that you're seeing, so that's why it doesn't look the same. But those are, very, the Pentateuch and Haftarah book, the Hertz is the oldest, it's not the oldest commentary ever, but it's, it was commonly used before these newer ones came out, and that's what we originally had at Beth Hillel when I came. And then we added the red Eitz Chaim, which is really the Torah commentary of the conservative movement. And then there also, if you want a Torah commentary for home, the third one from the left is the Reform Movement's The Torah, a Modern Commentary, which was being updated and improved when we decided to get new Chumashim, and that's why we don't have those in the pew, because the conservative one was already done, and we like that too. The Women's Torah Commentary does not have the Haftarot. It's literally just a commentary on the Torah. But any of these three are very, useful for weekly use in a synagogue or for home study, if you want to have both the Torah and the Haftarah commentary on both. So a Chumash, these are examples of a Chumash. It comes from the word Chamesh, which means 5, and the 5 books. And sometimes they're also called a Torah commentary, or you'll hear it called a Pentateuch, which is the same thing as the 5 or the 5 books of Moses. And as I said, usually has both Torah and Haftarah, but the women's commentary does not. So these terms that we've talked about tonight then so far, Tanakh and its subcategories, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, the Haftarah, the Chumash, these have the sacred scriptures that forms the basis of our synagogue use and weekly learning in the life of the Jewish community. Questions before I go on to the next category, or comments? Anyone?
I've learned a lot already.
Oh, good.
How do they determine what writings became the writings?
Again,
where they-
I mean, are you asking how did the books get included in the Bible?
Yeah. Especially in the writings. I mean, obviously the Torah and even the prophets I can kind of understand, but when it gets into the Ketuvim, the writings, how they determine those.
Yeah, there's a whole discussion about that in the Mishnah, I think, because the sages decided what was in and what was out, and there was a debate about one book for sure, and that's the Book of Esther, because it does not mention God in the entire book, and there were sages who thought it wasn't appropriate to put it in the canon of the Bible, but obviously it made it in, and the rationalization is, well, even though God isn't mentioned per se, it's clear that God's hand is at work in this story. Otherwise how could Haman have been defeated and Esther and Mordecai have prevailed? Another one that they apparently debated quite a bit about was Song of Songs, or Hebrew Shir HaShirim, which if you read it is basically a love poem, a very long love poem, and I mean, you might even say at certain points erotic. And so if you haven't read it, pick it up. But so some of the rabbis were uncomfortable. Why should that be sacred scripture? Why are we including that? And I think Rabbi Akiva is credited with having pushed for it to be included, making the connection that it's really a love poem between God and the people of Israel, that it can be read that way. So it's, that's what I know about it. That's, there's probably a lot more to be said, but does that answer your question?
Yep.
Good. Was there someone else who had a question? Okay. So now we're going to go on to the category called rabbinic literature. And probably you've heard these terms, Talmud, Mishnah. I'm not sure about Gemara, maybe not so much. So I have this little equation here that Talmud equals Mishnah plus Gemara, and I'm going to explain what that is, what that means. The Talmud basically is a multiple volume work of Jewish legal discussion and debate. It's like sort of, if you know legal terms, it's like case law in American law. It's not a code of law. A code of law is a list of laws. Here are the laws, A, B, C, D, E. Here's all the laws about how you keep a kosher home. Here's all the laws about what you do when there's a death and mourning. It's not like that. It's great sages throughout the ages, and it's interesting because they debate with each other even when they're living in a different generation. They'll talk about, have a debate with someone who lived in a prior generation as if they're alive. They'll reference what they said and say, but I think it's this way. So it's debate and discussion, and they don't always even come to a conclusion and tell you what they decided. Sometimes it's just a record of their discussion. So if you were to come up to the temple library, and I encourage you to do that anytime you want, with a mask on, because Terry Thornton has been doing an amazing job reorganizing the library, and you'll see that we have several sets of Talmud that are, at least two, that are complete, that it's the size of an encyclopedia on the shelf. So it's a huge compendium of Jewish legal discussion and debate, and it has two main parts. And this is an example of what a page of Talmud looks like. Unfortunately, the only one I could find with arrows and explanation is some language I don't know, like some Slavic language or something. But it helped me to see what I wanted to show you. So the Mishnah, this is a page of Talmud, and at some point, not on every page, but on lots of pages, you'll find the letters Mem, Tav, Nun, Yud. I don't know if you can see that clearly, but it's bigger than the other letters. That means Mishnah in Aramaic, and I'm going to explain what Mishnah is and what Aramaic is. And then Gimel Mem is for Gemara. So the original text is this much, and then the Gemara is the commentary on this little text here. Typically Mishnahs are little like this, paragraph long maybe, and the Gemara can go on for pages and pages and pages, and then finally you'll come up to another Mishnah. So I wonder if I skipped a slide here. Let me just see. No. So, and before I go on to the next slide, what's around the outside then, it says here, I don't know if you can see, it says Rashi, but not in English, another language. But the most famous and important commentator on the Talmud is Rashi. So his commentary is always in the net closest to the text and in the inside of where the page would be bound. So the binding would be here, and he's always next to the binding. That's considered the choicest spot. Over here, we have another commentary called the Tosafot, and then it varies from volume to volume of Talmud what these other littler commentaries are that are chosen. And then there'll be notes at the bottom of the page. So, this is what the Talmud looks like, and I know it looks like just a big jumble, and, like, who can read that? And it is very, very challenging to study and to understand. So the Mishnah is the oldest part of the Talmud, and it was written in Hebrew at about 200 CE. Now, think about what was going on in Jewish history then. The temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Romans in 70. And some Jews were taken captivity into various parts of the Roman Empire, but some did stay in ancient Israel or Palestine. And those who stayed, it was a difficult time, and they kind of saw their way of life the rug being pulled out from under them, because Jewish life was centered around the temple, and the temple no longer existed, and the priests were the leader of the Jewish community, and they had nothing left to do without a temple. They didn't have a job. And so Jewish life had to kind of be reinvented. And so still in 200 CE, the Romans are in charge, and the Jews that are left can see, the sages and the rabbis, the leaders of the community from the scholarly standpoint can see that if they don't do something quick, they're going to lose their whole knowledge base, which was an oral tradition. So it wasn't oral. The Mishnah up to that point hadn't been written down or probably even called the Mishnah, was sort of the body of oral discussion and debate among scholars about how do we live Jewish life in our times. So when you read the Mishnah, it's clear that it's still written from the standpoint of the temple in existence. But it was captured, kind of like an emergency way, like we got to get this down. And they wrote down as much as they could, as fast as they could, because they knew that there wasn't going to be much left of Jewish life where they were. And so the Mishnah became like the curriculum for the house of study where the Jews were. And primarily they were in two places. They were in Babylonia, which they had gone there when the first temple was destroyed in 586 BCE, so 500 or 600 years before that. We tell the story that the temple was destroyed, but then the benevolent King Cyrus of Persia allowed the Jews to return, and they built a second temple. But not all the Jews returned. A lot of them stayed in Babylonia. And Babylonia was still really the center of, in many ways, the center of Jewish scholarly life. And so a lot of the Jews went there, and they established houses of study there. And their curriculum was the Mishnah. And they discussed it and they commented on it. But also simultaneously, the Jews were up in northern Israel. They were still able to live a Jewish life up in northern Israel, away from Jerusalem. They were doing the same thing, and they had the same Mishnah, and they had it as their curriculum, and they studied it, and they commented on it. And so both of these geographically separated communities created a commentary on the Mishnah, and it was called the Gemara, which is written in Aramaic, not Hebrew, because it was the lingua franca of their time. That was the language they spoke. And so they wrote it in Aramaic. And we discussed before how it's a very closely related language to Hebrew, but it is not Hebrew. And so we say that the material from the Gemara is from 200 CE to 500 or 600 CE, and that depends on which version. So the Babylonian Talmud has stars around it because it is much more authoritative, it's much more complete, it's much more respected. When people talk about the Talmud, they're talking about the Babylonian Talmud. The Palestinian Talmud is shorter, fewer of the Mishnahs are commented on. It's not as comprehensive. It's sometimes also called the Jerusalem Talmud, which is a complete misnomer because it was not written in Jerusalem. As I said, it was written in the north, where Jewish life was possible. So if you're talking about the material in the Palestinian Talmud, it ends at 500 CE. If you're talking about the Babylonian, the writing of it concludes in about 600 CE.
Again,
Questions?
Jewish class.
Anyone have a question so far about?
I made fresh coffee for you.
It's complicated, I know. So,
I have a question.
Go ahead.
How did it happen that the Babylonian Talmud was written in Hebrew, yet you say it was both the Babylonian and the Palestinian was written in Aramaic? How?
Yes. Yeah, because that was the language everybody spoke by then. They
so
weren't
before
speaking,
that,
they were using Hebrew for study and prayer, for prayer, but that was not their everyday language anymore. So
even though if they were in Babylonia or if they were in
right,
northern Israel?
right.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. I think that's correct. I should double check that, but I think that is correct. It's not, it's not like you need to know this to be Jewish, but I do think we throw these terms around a lot, and, it's confusing what they are. Now, last year we had a whole class, was that last year, on Pirkei Avot? I think it was. Pirkei Avot is one of the sections of the Mishnah. So it is a Mishnah, It is from the Mishnah, and it is written in Hebrew. And you can get the Mishnah as a separate book, actually. But it's incomplete because it doesn't have its all-important commentary. And the Talmud is mainly commentaries and extrapolations on the sacred texts that we talked about earlier. Not like, let's read the whole book of Genesis and comment on that. It's more categorized by topic. And so they pull out from the sacred text quotations that say, we base these laws about, let's say, the Passover Seder on these verses in the Tanakh. But everything's categorized by, civil law, death and mourning, festivals, etc., instead of by the books of sacred literature. And really, to understand what Judaism came to be after the temple was destroyed, and to understand what it is today, you have to have the Talmud. If you read the Tanakh only, and there are people, I get this all the time, people who call me on the phone and say, I'm reading my Bible, and some guy just called me last week and said, could you tell me what the golden scepter is? And I was like, the golden scepter? I mean, I have no idea. It's probably some obscure thing from what was in the ancient temple or something, because he probably thinks that we still, Judaism is what you read in the Tanakh. And it's not at all. I mean, so for example, I think kosher is a good example. All that it says in the Torah about keeping kosher is you shouldn't cook a calf in its mother's milk, and there's forbidden and permitted animals. It doesn't say anything about, not having a cheeseburger or having separate dishes, or how do you make a kitchen kosher. That all comes later. And so, and of course, the main issue for the rabbis when they were writing down the Mishnah and then commenting on it in the Gemara was, wait, there isn't any temple anymore. So how do we do Judaism? And so they basically created what Judaism became, which was prayer and deeds of kindness and mitzvot, instead of taking sacrifices to the temple to have a relationship with God. And they really retooled Judaism completely in the Gemara. So questions or comments about that?
Did you ever see the Idiot's Guide to the Talmud?
No. Is it good?
I don't know. I've seen it. I never read it, but I've seen it on Amazon.
In general, I think those idiots' guides are pretty good.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah, but I've never.
Maybe I'll read it. I don't know. I listen to Audible a lot, so maybe I'll do it on Audible.
Yeah.
I'll let you know.
Okay.
What do the words Mishnah and Gemara, what do those words actually mean?
Mishnah means repetition, and Gemara means learning. So, repetition because, again, it was an oral tradition initially, and it was passed down by repeating it, memorizing it, and repeating it, and passing it on to the next generation. And Gemara was, they sat in the houses of study and they learned together, and they wrote, they discussed and they debated. So it's basically the Aramaic word for learning. Good question. So one thing that's important to understand, though, is that from an Orthodox standpoint, even though these materials were written so much later than sacred scriptures, in the Orthodox world, they are viewed as equally coming from God at Sinai. So they teach that there was an oral law and a written law that came down to Moses at Sinai. And the written law became the Tanakh. And the oral law was what eventually got written down in the Mishnah and the Gemara, but they believed that it was faithfully passed down as an oral tradition through all that time. And, we don't know when Sinai happened. I mean, lots of times it's dated around 1200 BCE. So we're talking about, well over 1,000 years until this finally got written down. But those in the traditional branches of Judaism teach that this also, all of this, and when the rabbis were talking about it and debating and discussing, it was coming down to them as received tradition from God, passed on through many generations. I would say that in Reform Judaism, we view all of that literature as our sacred, or our great literary tradition that is, has much to teach us about our values and our ethics and how to live Jewish lives, but it is not from Mount Sinai.
So that's how the Orthodox could take, like with kashrut, and how it goes so much further in than what's just in the Torah, because it's equated. It's like on that same level.
Yeah, they say, well, God knew that we were going to be living in these times, and we were going to have utensils and whatever, and
Right.
kitchens, and so God provided for all that in the oral tradition that came down to us through our revered and completely brilliant sages who memorized every word and passed it on to the next one and the next one till it came to us. Now I have to tell you, Talmud I had to take it in rabbinical school. I took 2 classes in Talmud. I struggled with it. I really didn't totally understand what it was. Very different than what a conservative rabbi like Linda and Dick's son Dan went through. They have to learn, I believe it's 66 pages of Talmud backward and forward. I believe that's true in the conservative movement by the time they're ordained. So, they are much more masterful in their
I'll
understanding.
have to ask him about
I
that.
think that's true. They master it, and much more than we Reform rabbis do. Maybe our program is a little more intensive now than it was when I was there, but I really didn't feel like I fully grasped it until I started to teach it. And I was encouraged to teach it by a great Talmud scholar named Adin Steinsaltz, who I had the great fortune to to meet once in Milwaukee when he came to talk to the Wisconsin Council of Rabbis, because he made the Talmud accessible to the average person by first writing a commentary in modern Hebrew, and then in Russian, and then in English. And he produced a modern version of the Talmud with the text that you saw in the middle with no vowels. He had that all the vowels put in, so that's very helpful. And then some of the traditional commentary was around it, but then his own translation and commentary was around it. And then now I get it. Now I could understand it and teach it. And we had I don't know if any of you were in it, but we had a Talmud circle at Beth Hillel that met for 16 years before it kind of fell apart. And I really learned a lot of Talmud in those 16 years with the help only because of Adin Steinsaltz. Let's see. Before I get to Midrash, which is often confused with Mishnah, any questions on Talmud?
They talk about like mysticism and stuff with the Talmud too, right?
They do, and I'm going to come to mysticism at the end. So
Okay.
Kabbalah and mysticism at the end tonight.
Okay.
So Midrash, what is Midrash? So this literature starts in the rabbinic period, but then it goes longer into the medieval period. So there are Midrash compendia that are from around 200 all the way up to 1000 CE. And there are many different collections of Midrash. There's not one work called the Midrash, although you might think so sometimes, because lots of times rabbis or other Jewish teachers will say, in the Midrash it says this. But which Midrash? There are many of them. And there are two categories of Midrash. One is Midrash Halacha. Halacha is Jewish law. So there are, Midrash really means to interpret. So there are interpretations of Jewish law, types of Midrash. And then there are interpretations of stories or legends. And that's what Midrash Agadah is. It sounds like Haggadah, right? So Haggadah, the book we use on Pesach, means the story, the telling of the story, right? So Midrash Agadah are, I like to say, they're stories about stories in the Torah or other books of the Bible. And I put stars by that because that's what we usually think of as Midrash, stories about stories in the Torah. What ones can you think of? Anyone know something that is a Midrash about a biblical story that isn't actually in the Torah, but it's a story that we might know very well? Don't all jump at once.
I think when you and I talked about Abraham and the idols,
Yes,
isn't that a midrash?
it is. It is very good, Ellie. So, we all know that Abraham was the first one to believe in one God, right? But how did he figure that out when everybody around him was an idol worshiper? You ask that question when you read the story, and so did the great sages and rabbis of the rabbinic period. They asked the same question. And so instead of say, I don't know, who knows, we can't ever know, they made up a story to explain it. It sounds crazy, but they did. And this one that I think probably you've heard, and I bet a lot of people think this is in the Torah, but it's not, is that Abraham's father Terach, who is a real character in the Torah, owned an idol store that is not in the Torah. And that he made the idols out back, and then he brought them out in the front and sold them. And one day he left Abraham, when he was a boy, in charge of the store because he had to go do errands or whatever. And he came back, and while he was gone, Abraham had smashed some of the idols because Abraham had come to understand somehow in his precociousness that there was only one God and these idols were ridiculous. And so, his dad comes back and he says, Abraham, what did you do? And Abraham says, I didn't do it. That big idol up there on the shelf, he smashed the other ones. And his dad says, don't be ridiculous. I make those out in the back. And he said, so Dad, why do you believe in them? Why do you sell them to people? So that's a very famous story about Abraham. Who's heard that story before? Raise your hand if you've heard it. And maybe you thought it's in the Torah, but no, it's not. It's a midrash. Okay? Another example. Anyone have another example? I'll give you another one. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is also about Abraham. God tells Abraham, things are really bad in those cities and I'm going to have to go destroy them. They're so wretched and corrupt. But it doesn't say, well, what was so bad? What did they do that was so bad? So the rabbis go on and on about what was so bad about Sodom. Now we do learn some things in the Torah, but they go on and on about how intolerance of strangers was really the horrible thing about Sodom and Gomorrah. And if someone, all the beds in Sodom were the same size. So if someone came to town and needed a bed for tonight and they didn't fit in the bed, they'd, chop off their legs to make them fit, or they would stretch them out if they were too short. That's how bad the people of Sodom were. That's a midrash. That is not in the Torah. Or you probably know the story at the end of the Torah where Moses is destined to die before seeing the promised land. And it always seems to many of us like, oh, that's just so sad, why couldn't he go to the promised land? And so there's a whole elaborate conversation in the midrash about how Moses begs God, please, can't I just go and take a quick visit and come, couldn't I just see, couldn't you just show me? Very long and dragged out, and that's a midrash. That is not in the Torah. So usually when we think of midrash, we think of these kinds of stories that really embellish and beautify Jewish life and literature, but they're not sacred scripture. I just brought the one from this week's Torah portion to give you an idea. This week's Torah portion is Vayeshev. Genesis 37 verse 3 says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all of his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors." Well, maybe that's unsatisfying to you. Like, okay, maybe he liked him more because he was like the kid he had when he was really old. But why would he do something so, that made it, was so obvious to others that he was the favorite? Why did he love Jacob that much more? You might ask that question. The rabbis ask that question, and this is what a midrash says about it. Joseph's beauty of person was equal to that of his mother Rachel, and Jacob had to but look at him to be consoled for the death of his beloved wife. Reason enough for distinguishing him among his children. That's one midrashic type of answer that you will see in this kind of literature. Questions or comments about midrash?
We don't know they're true or whatever. These are just kind of like their opinions or from their ideas.
Their stories, parables, interpretations. We don't actually know. We don't actually know if the Bible is true. We don't have any proof.
Right. Do you believe these? Like you believe the Torah, or
now you're asking if I believe the Torah too. I don't believe that the Torah or the midrash is history. I think they're our epic story, and I believe them in the sense that I find truth in them, in the sense that they teach us timeless messages about how to live our lives and how to be good people and what kind of person to emulate and to try to become. I don't believe them to be literally true or factually to be able to figure out if they're true or not. And that doesn't matter to me, that I can't prove that these things are true. What matters to me is what they can teach us.
I like that.
Doesn't disappoint you too much.
Not at all. I like it.
When we teach it to our kids in school, we don't go into all that. We teach them the stories as beautiful stories that have a message to teach. When they get to be about confirmation age, I start to burst their bubble a little bit.
I always thought that the midrash were like the stories of the city where everybody was stupid.
Those are Hasidic tales. Those, it's the term midrash is still used today. Sometimes you'll say that something is a modern midrash, like the stories that Mark Gellman wrote that I really love. Or some people will say, if anyone has read The Red Tent by Anita Diamant, that's an extended modern midrash. So midrash is really, you're taking something from this Bible and you're embellishing it and bringing it out more. Whereas the Hasidic tales, like the tales of Chelm, they're not really related to the Bible at all. They're Jewish stories, but they have nothing to do with sacred scripture.
So what do you call them? Because I thought it was the same word, but is there
Hasidic tales?
Oh,
I would call them.
okay.
Yeah. And there's a whole there's tons of Jewish literature that isn't sacred literature at all. Yiddish literature from the 19th century and I suppose even further back, but its heyday was sort of in the 19th and early 20th century, is, wonderful Jewish stories and novels and things that were written about it from a Jewish world and about a Jewish world, but they aren't at all related to stories in the Bible. or the
So
classical literature.
that's the difference, is a midrash has to be related to something in the Bible. It has to be trying to
yeah.
explain or
I
make
would say it's embellishing something in the Bible, or maybe in the Talmud, because there are also stories told about the rabbis that I would put in the category of midrash. You know, that like the story about a Rabbi Akiva and how he met his wife Rachel, and he was so poor, but she loved him anyway, and he didn't know any Hebrew, but she believed he could be a great scholar, and that's a midrash about a rabbinic figure. So I would say it's embellishment and interpretation of classical Jewish literature.
Okay.
Good question. Really good question. All right, so now what about the mystical literature? So I'm going to start by saying that I am not very well informed about mysticism, which most people know the term Kabbalah here, which means a received tradition. But the term, I mean, Kabbalah is, it's a word we use like for Kabbalat Shabbat, right? Receiving or welcoming in Shabbat. It's the same word. But when we talk about Kabbalah or Kabbalah, lots of times people say with a capital K, they're talking about the mystical strand within Jewish tradition. And you'll often see this diagram, right, to represent Kabbalah. And these words are all, words in Hebrew, but they put together in this schema is, and I don't pretend to understand it, is like the spheres or levels between our world and God's world. And if you can figure out the secrets of these words and how they relate to one another, you can eventually, reach God's realm. So there are words like Malchut, which is kingdom, Yesod, which is foundation, Hod, which is beauty, Netzach, eternity, Tiferet, also like a word of splendor more than beauty, Gevurah, power, Chesed, kindness, Da'at, knowledge, Bina, wisdom, Chochmah, another word for wisdom. These are all kind of synonyms. And Keter is crown. So in the Zohar, which is the most well-known of all of the mystical books, but not the only one, you will find explanations of this. So the Zohar is a mystical commentary on the Torah. And it's written in Aramaic. It comprises multiple volumes totaling over 1,000 pages. We have a copy of the Zohar at the temple, which somebody donated to us, brand new. I don't think the cover's ever been cracked. Certainly not by me. And so it's, again, an encyclopedia-like compendium of mystical writings about the Torah. Scholars now agree that it was written in the 13th century in Spain, probably by Rabbi Moses de Leon or Moshe de Leon, and probably multiple other authors. But it was written in Aramaic, that language we said was the lingua franca back in the time of the rabbis. It was purposely written in Aramaic, even though it wasn't the language that any of those guys spoke every day, in order to create the appearance of having been written way back in the rabbinic time. And so the Zohar is part of the whole body of tradition known as Kabbalah, or mystical understandings of Judaism. But it's the best known group of writings because a great scholar named Gershom Scholem in the 20th century made it popular. He and there have been also some very recent English translations which have helped people to read it. It's very difficult to understand because it's very dense and obscure, and even in translation, it's very difficult to understand. but those who, are into this kind of stuff and want to explore it will enter a very like fantastical universe that's filled with spiritual contemplation and insight. And, people who get into Kabbalah believe that if you really master this, you'll unlock the secrets of the universe. And so I'm curious.
Post that over the map of Oak Island. All the notable points come on.
Michelle, you were the one who really wanted to know about this. Have you looked into it, or do people ask you about it, or?
Like love that kind of stuff, and I always read about, like finding enlightenment and,
Olives for
stuff like
Hollywood.
that.
Look
And
cool.
I never saw that sign that you have there.
You
the-
have? Okay. Yeah.
No, and I'm thinking, but I've read so many spiritual books and things like that, and I'm thinking it's like how they say, I don't know if you read this, but I've read like how when you die and you go different, some people are at different levels, so like if you kill people in your life, of course you're going to be like down here, and the goal is to get like closer and be absorbed into God.
Wow. That's
So
very
I've read like all kinds of things like that. And they say like we're all intertwined and we're all really one energy, kind of like I can't think of the word. What's that one study of energy? And
Anyone know what she's talking about?
can't think of what it is, but quantum physics.
Okay. It's
says that
very,
we're-
that's very fascinating stuff. And, I think you can dabble into Kabbalah probably by, reading articles or, a popular book that tries to explain it. But, it's the actual Zohar. I think you'd have to devote a lifetime to it. And the rabbis of ancient times said that you shouldn't even begin to study the mystical texts of Judaism, whatever they were in their time, until you're at least 40 and you've mastered Tanakh and Talmud, and then maybe you'd be ready to study this mystical
Yeah.
material.
It is very like different,
Esoteric,
but
yeah.
it just, I don't know why I'm always just like fascinated
It's
by
fascinating.
it.
I mean,
It is.
and
It
it's
is.
fascinating to the extent that you may know that there's these Kabbalah centers. I think they still exist.
Like Madonna.
Yeah, Madonna and some other famous people were like really into it. But the thing is, they weren't even Jewish.
I know.
So how they didn't even know like what the Torah was that it was commenting on. They just wanted to go. They wanted to get that enlightenment and unlock the secrets of the universe, and so they went right to Kabbalah. Directly to it. And,
There was criticism about that too, because they hadn't done the study. They hadn't gone to read, those that, are really into it, hadn't gone to that point. So for them to do it, it was almost like the criticism was like it was trivializing it.
And also, I think the people who run these Kabbalah centers were making a lot of money off of it, because, you had to buy in the old days, their tapes or their CDs.
Right.
And you had to pay them a lot of
Scientology.
money to, but then, people were duped that they thought they were going to unlock the secrets of the universe. And in fact, they were just paying money to these charlatans who,
Right.
claim to know all these secrets and to be able to teach them to people.
I remember seeing this chart in Israel in the mystical city of Sfat, where artists have done some very cool renderings of this.
Yeah, you can see it. I mean, even if you look online,
Right.
we took this off the internet. You'll find a lot of different beautiful renditions of this. I wanted to find one that was easy to.
Like a mandala, right?
Yeah,
kind of.
kind of like that.
Yeah.
Kind of a Jewish mandala. You're right.
Yeah.
I think this is my last slide. Let's see. Yeah, it is. So, questions or comments before we close for the evening?
Maybe that's the secret of the universe, is that you can make a lot of money trying to convince people that you have it.
Yeah.
I have a question. I came in a little bit late, so I don't know if you had already talked about this. But how do you know the difference between Hebrew and Aramaic when you're looking at it?
No, we didn't talk. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. There's it's hard to tell just by looking at it because it's the same exact letters, but the grammar is different. So, for example, in the Kaddish, you know, the word Kaddish is this. That's the Aramaic, but Hebrew is Kadosh. Okay, so they're so closely related. Shemay, you know, in the Kaddish we say Yehei Shemay Rabbah Mivarach. Shemay in Hebrew is Shemo. It means his name. So the suffixes, the prefixes are different. You know, little spellings are different. I don't know if it'd be similar to like modern English versus Shakespearean English. You know, it's just enough different that you might have to have help understanding it. And you know, when you study Talmud, you have to learn Aramaic. And you know, it's pretty easy to grasp the differences. But yeah, it's just a slightly different language. So because you came in late, that reminds me, I wanted to tell everybody that next week I want to do it from 6:30 to 7:30 because there's something I need to do at 7:30. So I hope that's okay with everybody, and I'll put it in the e-news, and hopefully people will remember. So
Rabbi, I have a question too.
Oh, sure.
What is it that Terry teaches?
Musar. I thought someone would ask that. So Musar is not a piece of literature. It is not a book. It is a movement. It is a Jewish educational, ethical, and cultural movement that was developed in the 19th century in Lithuania. Started out as popular among Orthodox Lithuanian Jews, but it has been popularized in recent years as a way of a spiritual practice by concentrating on ethical principles. But it uses traditional texts and some of the writings of Rabbi Israel Salanter, who was the founder of this movement, to teach these things. It's not its own book.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for listening, everybody. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and also happy Hanukkah, because we'll be a few days into that before we meet again. And don't forget, every night on Zoom for Hanukkah, 5:45 to 6, we'll have a little temple gathering. You can bring your menorah, light it with your temple family. We'll sing a song, we'll do a reading, something like that, just 15 minutes. So, all right, good to see everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.